Hey, welcome back to Guard Bros Field Desk. I have for you Chapter 9 of the Book 1 Mk.II redo. Like, subscribe, comment down below. Let's go. Yule brought Brita back to the Sparkling Unicorn a few hours later and dropped her off in her room. Yule instructed the guard outside to let her go back and forth, but with someone accompanying her just to make sure the locals didn't drag her into an alleyway for a kill. It was evening, and Yule hadn't eaten much except for stall snacks, needing something more filling to stop the ceaseless growling in his stomach. Down in the Sparkling Unicorn's main dining area, it was hopping and popping as per normal, with a solid amount of the Veil Riders gearing up to hike it to the Pleasure District. Yule didn't approve of it, but the money made from selling blueprints for advancements in the city was spread evenly after Yule took the lion's share, and they were able to spend it as they saw fit. Why they chose to spend it on flesh, Yule would never know, nor really care to understand. He sat down at one of the long tables near Gremlin and a few other Veil Riders who ate and chatted, while Chikily snored drunkenly from a chair in the corner, curled up and drooling on himself. "Howdy, Gremlin. How goes it?" Her bright eyes had their usual sleepy bags under them, but she seemed to be in a chipper mood, eyes bright with her usual keen intelligence.
Got all my drones recharged. Besides that, been mostly trying to figure out how the time thing works, magic in general, why there's not enough gravity here for the size of the planet, that kind of stuff.
Trying to solve all the world's mysteries, are you? Yule asked as he waved at a barmaid who whirled through the many chairs and tables to see what he wanted. He asked for tea and whatever they were serving for dinner, and she rushed off to the kitchen to put it in. Yule then went on to tell Gremlin what he was told by Brita, watching her type away on the keyboard of her struggling laptop.
Acting buddy-buddy? Buddy-buddy how? We talking drinking buddies or old frat brothers buddy-buddy?
Gremlin asked in monotone while multitasking, trying to eat around her laptop, talk to Yule, and simultaneously playing a match of Towns and Castles 3. The elves of the inn were worried she wasn't eating enough and were constantly plying her with food. This seemed to have jump-started something in her, and now she was constantly in a state of either eating or teching, while sleep seemed to always be in the back burner. Don't know. All she said was buddy-buddy and didn't really elaborate. You don't think they're in on it, right? In the role-playing games, there was always stuff like changelings running around, doppelgangers, fae who live for centuries. That couldn't happen, right? Yule asked as he turned to Gremlin and heard the entire table go quiet after his words. Gremlin's mouth was in an odd, appreciative grin, her teeth showing brightly blue and green in the glow of her laptop.
Yule, you aren't going conspiracy on us, are you?
Veil Riders exchanged glances and smiled at each other while leaning in to listen further. Well, come on now, I'm not talking like Illuminati or something, but what if something passed through and has been guiding humans back to the Veil? Yule said in a strained tone and felt stupid as soon as the words left his mouth.
Ah, you mean like secret societies that are based solely on conspiracy theories?
Gremlin asked wryly and folded her hands under her chin while the other Veil Riders at the table began pulling out their notebooks.
Oh, Yule, I knew you would fall to the dark side with us.
All Yule could do was lean back in his seat with a look of dawning defeat as the table suddenly erupted into a chorus of chatter, with Gremlin shouting,
I told you! I fucking told you!
over the lot of them. It appeared that under Yule's nose, a lot of Veil Riders had been weaving their own web of theories about what was going on all this time and how it may tie into the mythos of home, including such things as Stonehenge, the pyramids, Nostradamus actually being a really tall dwarf, Da Vinci being a southern elf, and of course the secret societies that worked in the shadows. The barmaid walked over and began setting down Yule's food and drink in front of him, making sure to brush her chest on his shoulder as she did. She looked down to see if he was paying attention, but instead of seeing lust for flesh in his eyes, He was instead staring with soulless dread at his Veil Riders, who were now gesturing wildly and yelling at each other while holding up their notebooks. The barmaid glared with him and furrowed her brows at the Veil Riders as they ranted, still holding on to his mug.
They're ruining my chances every damn day,
she thought to herself and huffed, releasing Yule's mug and sauntering away back towards the kitchen. The Veil Riders and Gremlin were now almost yelling at each other and pointing at Yule, who just tried to pretend the butter was saying nice things to him as he spread it on his bread. The other non-human patrons of the inn were rather enjoying the odd scene, talking amongst themselves and dodging the occasional thrown pencil.
Even Yule thinks there's something going on. You heard him say it!
Gremlin yelled while spinning around her laptop and began tapping the screen.
Look, it all makes sense if you plot major events along with the supposed intervals that the two sides of the veil align in time. For all we know, the grassy knoll shooter could have been a fairy.
This comment made the entire table uproar, and other Veil Riders overheard, walking over to throw in their 2 cents. While they argued around him, Yule sat in the middle, doing his best to just eat his food and not feed into what he started. As a ball of paper bounced off his head and 2 Veil Riders began a loud argument over whether or not Franz Ferdinand could have been killed by a rogue kobold, Yule quietly wished he had just kept his mouth shut. From the main bar, a few of the Valley Elf barmaids were watching the event unfold with amusement. None of them knew what was being said, but it certainly seemed like a heated discussion. One of the barmaids leaned towards the other barmaid coming back from Yule, a smug grin playing along her teeth.
Looks miserable, don't he? Any luck wooing the pure and noble Yule, Callie? Fuck off, Celia.
Callie barked as she strode past them, face rife with indignation, and shoved open the door to the kitchens with a fiery punch of a fist. The rest of the girls laughed at her expense, before one turned to Celia.
Pure and noble? What are you on about? I've seen him eyeball a leg or two during breakfast.
Celia shrugged while cleaning some of the tankards with a wet rag. She nodded her auburn-haired head towards the still snoozing harpy.
Chikily there says that Yule has been fighting off that Himalayan matriarch. Yethis says that he even rebuked the head sorceress that first met him, and herself. She tried offering to help him bathe, and he locked her in a closet. Guy is a strange one for sure.
Strange? No. Sad? Perhaps.
All the girls looked over to Alavara, who had spoken up in Yule's defense. Second in command when it came to the inn, she was an older valley elf that ran most of the night duties and minded after the barmaids and cooks. Alavara's hair was a rarer crimson color, and her eyes followed the same touch of red, being called one of the blood-touched. Due to her odd nature, she had the ability to grift the thoughts of others and steal ideas. She could not mind read per se, that is to press herself into a mind by force. If she was welcomed into the mind, she could, but she usually just mentally rode the waves that people put out as they thought. Her invisible mental tendrils would reach out and caress those whom she wanted to know certain things from, such as if they wanted a new ale or something was wrong with the service. It certainly helped her pick up on people who didn't pay their tabs, or were sneaking away with the cutlery. She watched Yule slowly drink from his mug as Gremlin desperately tried to get him to look at her screen, urging him to tell the rest of the Veil Riders she was right. He continued to feign ignorance of those around him, moving his spoon around a hand holding a notepad up near his face. Alavara stared at Yule with her arms crossed under her ample chest, as she did on many nights, and felt the same waves of self-doubt she had felt wafting off of him like a nervous perfume.
I think Yule had a wife at one time. When he catches himself staring at a rump or thigh, he gives off huge waves of shame and sorrow before closing himself off. From how he acts and how he feels, he may have lost her violently, or in a way he was not okay with.
Alavara turned and slapped Celia on the shoulder with the back of her hand, then pointed at Yule.
Get him more tea, and be nice about it. Don't go pressing your tits against him like that tart Callie.
Celia grumbled, rubbing her shoulder before going into the kitchen to grab another mug for Yule. Alavara looked back to Yule and leaned down onto the counter to rest on her elbows, her chin perched on her hands. Her scarlet-tinged eyes bore holes into Yule as he tried to make his Veil Riders calm down and talk in a lower tone of voice. She was able to worm her way in and pick out a single thought as Celia distracted him by putting down a fresh mug of tea, picking up his empty one. Of course, he was already distracted by his men-at-arms, all of them trying to get him to agree with whatever it was they had written down on their pads of paper. Alavara murmured under her breath as she snatched up his thought, his memory, and ferreted away inside her own mind.
Not like she used to make it, huh? Good to know. I'll see you at breakfast then.
Despite the energy pulsing through the inn, the Veil Riders eventually made their way to their rooms, including Yule, who had more than enough of conspiracy theories for one day. The next morning, everyone was still in bed when the sun came up, and the crowing of fowl disturbed the peaceful silence, except for two of the company, who were already awake. Chikily was still passed out asleep in the chair he fell in, and someone had draped a whoopee over him before they had gone to bed, in which he was curled up and snoring softly. Yule was already busily scribbling away at paperwork and writing his reports to Coco so he could stay in the loop, blinking tiredly down at the paper as he wrote. Beside him, Eris was having breakfast and sipping tea, waiting for Yule to finish up with his letters so she could take it to Zerg Company. Eris kind of liked this morning ritual she had fallen into, but was worried because it seemed like Yule never slept, always waiting for her when she arrived just as the sun was rising. As he wrote, he would always buy her food and make sure she had the energy for what the Harpies called the Zerg Run, ferreting mail and correspondence between the two units of humans. Yule always made sure she drank her tea for some reason, and wouldn't let her set off until the bowl of whatever they gave her was empty. Eris didn't like the stuff they put in the mugs, but Yule seemed to think it was important, so she put up with it. It was the most stable time of her life, as far as she could remember, and this weird little ritual was the cornerstone of her day. Eris leaned over to peer at the letters Yule had spread around the tabletop as she held her mug in her wing digits. She could recognize the language of the Valley Elves and the runes of the Dwarves, and could pick up on a little of what Yule was doing. It seemed that he was trading information to the Dwarves on something called a blast furnace and a kind of bell that helps make steel. To the Valley Elves, he kept mentioning some kind of special mold on bread, which they were equally keen to learn more of. Eris raised her eyebrows over the rim of her mug as she saw the number of zeros after the negotiation prices, and quietly pondered if any of the Veil Riders under Yule would be fond of feathered women. She would have tried with Yule, but he never seemed interested and she wasn't going to push the issue.
That...
She thought with a shiver of fear.
And Savaris was trying to get her claws into him, and the butcher would probably turn her into feelings for a pillow if she got in her way.
Eris turned her head as she slurped and saw that one of the night workers was here this morning, the one with the red hair and eyes like that of a coal fire. Eris's large eyes swiveled back and forth from Yule beside her to the woman walking over. Alavara had another mug in her hand, a bit larger than Eris's and not made for harpies to hold. Alavara had spent the better part of her morning trying to figure out the concoction that Yule's wife used to make for him during his breakfast, and believed she had done it. She wore something a bit prettier than what she usually would, adorning her ears with winding silver draped jewelry and a dress that gave her hips a little more sway than they really needed. Yule stopped scribbling for a moment to flex his hand, grumbling, annoyed at his aching wrist. Eris gave him a quick pop in the ribs with her elbow, and when he looked over at her, she nodded forward towards Alavara, while still hiding behind the rim of her mug. Yule gave his head a wiggle to make sure the amulet was still touching his head under his patrol cap before speaking. "Alavara?" Yule said politely, still flexing his writing hand while rubbing his wrist with the other. "You're here awfully early. I thought you didn't like working the mornings."
I don't.
Alavara said with a kind smile, and softly set the mug down in front of him with a slight thump of the wooden tabletop.
I had an idea and wanted you to try it for me. This one isn't poisoned, I promise.
Alavara looked down at Yule as she rested her pointer finger on the rim of the mug, out of which scented steam curled and drifted through the morning air. Yule looked down at the mug and saw it looked a lot darker and milkier than what they usually gave him, and smelled some familiar elements he would have enjoyed back home. Huh. I didn't think you guys had cinnamon here, Yule said as he set down his pen and reached over for the mug, Alavara's nail making a slight tink sound as the mug was lifted away from her finger.
It's called kiri bark here, and we mostly use it to keep bugs away. From what I've seen of what you people eat, I'm not shocked you think a poison for insects is a tasty treat.
Alavara said softly in an amused tone, a steady smile staying trained on Yule as she watched him sniff the rim of the mug. Eris knew about kiri bark as well, and dropped her mug slightly so her mouth was no longer behind it and unmuffled.
Harpies use kiri bark for nests too. Keeps away the beetles and ants.
We also use a lot of things called peppers in our food. Yule murmured over the steam of the mug and blew on it a little to cool it. There's some spices so hot that they can actually blind you or make your lungs become inflamed. Alavara gave a chuckle while taking a seat for herself and rested her head on the back of her left hand.
Sounds like something a human would enjoy. I still get complaints that our sauces aren't spicy enough all the time.
The fruits of her labors came to ripen as Yule took a deep pull from the mug, and she could feel the wave of homesickness that wafted away from him, as if he were the rolling tide and she were a beach of soft sand. Alavara opened the hooks of her mind's tendrils and grappled anything that came away, the invisible mental vines poised and ready. Something about this drink, the spices, whatever it was, it made Yule let his guard down completely, and she was awash in his memories. She saw his daughter, his wife, their home, their lives, the small things his wife would do for him, and the small things he would do for the both of them. Alavara's eyes softened as she took in this deluge of information and digested it. Yule lowered the mug and stared down into it, holding the liquid in his mouth as if afraid to swallow, but he eventually did. She saw his chest breathe in and out deeply as his thoughts traced among themselves. Even Eris could sense something was up, and thought the elf had casted some kind of spell on Yule. She furrowed her brows at Alavara and bared a fang as she prepared to make this breakfast table a whole lot messier than it currently was. Yule tilted his head to the side an inch and set the mug down next to his report going to Coco, murmuring to the two women near him. This is very similar to something I used to have back at my home. My wife used to make it for me in the mornings before I would start work. He looked at Alavara with eyes wreathed in sorrow, but deep inside them she saw small glimmers of happiness. I'm not sure how you came up with this, but thank you.
How long ago did you lose her?
Alavara inquired, not in a rude way, but in the tone of voice that most women are born with, in master, in order to coax the answers from naughty children or stubborn husbands. Yule's mouth twitched as he picked up his pen, and his lips came back to form a thin line. His other hand stroked his beard once before coming back down to settle the paper as he continued to write. Eris and Alavara were left in silence for several seconds, the rasping scribble of pen tipped to paper the only thing answering them until Yule broke the silence. It's been 3 years, Earth time. He continued to write as Alavara caught another wave of thoughts radiating from Yule and heard terse words and shouting. She spoke up again and poked the mug towards Yule ever so lightly, the tea inside sloshing a little bit as she did.
Old age? Sickness?
Yule kept writing, formulating his answer in his head as he remembered the entire scene from start to finish, the same scene that had plagued his dreams for 3 years. Eris set her mug down on the table and leaned forward to get a look at Yule's face. Accident, he said lowly, still writing. Alavara's mind picked up the sounds of violent, screeching metal which caused her feet to startle below the table, the sound reminding her of the nightmares that men-at-arms get when the two lines of armored warriors clash into one another. She saw a kind of carriage, but mangled beyond repair, torn and ripped open as if a drake had laid its claws into it.
Accident?
She stuttered, the feelings and thoughts of sadness quickly churning into self-loathing and rage. She could see the pen digging into the parchment, cutting deep grooves unlike his other, lighter handwriting. Yule closed his eyes and breathed in deep, filling his nose with the scent of this foreign cinnamon, milk, and herbal flowers that wafted up from the cup. He opened his sad blue eyes and set down his pen, leaning back and sitting up straight. His hands smoothed out his pant legs and then folded around the mug of tea, soaking up the warmth. We got into a fight. We had been married for over a decade. We're a team. Hell, our marriage survived things that would have ruined others. One day we got into a stupid argument over paint, of all things. She wanted the room purple. Yule looked at Alavara with a bitter, forlorn look. I wanted it gray. I told her that she always got her way with everything else, and I just wanted my office area gray. She said purple would make me feel better. Yule picked up the mug and took another drink from it, before exhaling out his mouth and setting the mug back down. I'm a bitter man at times, I know this. My experiences in the military, private security sector, just dealing with people, it made me so bitter. And I always tried to scrub it away when I was around her. For some reason, I don't know, I was having a bad day, stress of work, and I snapped at her, yelled at her like I would a naughty soldier. Can you just fucking let me have a damn thing my way for once, I said. Isn't it enough you get everything else? He shook his head slowly from side to side, ruefully, being an asshole over paint. She got mad at me, poured the tea she made me into the sink, and left saying she was going to go get me my stupid, boring gray paint. At the time, I thought she just wanted her space, so I didn't stop her. She left the house and got into an accident. There was another carriage, and the person driving it wasn't paying attention, wasn't obeying our road laws when it came to some signals, was using one of these things. Yule held up his beat-to-hell smartphone and wiggled it, mostly using it to look at pictures and do calculations before the phone itself died. The rudimentary ways they were charging their equipment wasn't healthy for them. He ran into her and hit her directly in the side of the carriage and killed her instantly. It broke her body, and they couldn't bring her back no matter how hard they tried. Yule began to roll up his report to Coco, the parchment rasping against his hands as he wound it around itself. Last thing I ever said to her was, take your time, your opinion won't be missed. I was mad about her bugging me about paint, and instead of saying, I love you, come home safe, I sent her off in dejection, and her believing she didn't matter to me. I waited all day for her to come home. Alavara saw him from his point of view, sitting on a porch step and wringing his hands as he stared down the roadway. She saw him check his little device, put it up to his ear, hear some kind of voice, and then turn it off. He did this nearly 30 times or so, the sun slowly traveling across the sky. He tied the scrolled up paper in its bindings and began heating wax on a little candle nearby. Yule's eyes were heavy with controlled emotion, but he still wrinkled his nose and grimaced, a deep frown scoring his face. Police came by, or guards, if you will, and told me what happened. I had to go identify her body and fill out the paperwork. Yule said quietly as he swirled the rolled up paper in front of his eyes while the wax was melting. I can still see her bruised and cut up face when I sleep. The collision was so violent that the glass cut her apart all over. Dozens of little cuts that ruined her skin. Knowing that in that head of hers were my last words, imprinted on her soul, I said I was sorry, and bawled like a damn baby over her corpse as it lay there on the rack. But it was too late for apologies. Too late to be the man I should have been in that moment. Yule sniffed angrily, poured a little bit of wax on the scrolled letter, and stamped it with the signet of the Veil Riders to seal it. Yule's fingers fiddled with the scroll of paper, rolling it around as he thought. He looked up to Alavara and smiled with melancholy as he handed the scroll to Eris. I purified her body and scattered the ashes in the mountains of her birthplace, way up where the snow never goes away. Then I painted my office purple and never forgave myself for being the asshole that I am. Eris reached up and took the scroll gently, her eyes wide with the sudden revelations of the human man beside her. Yule looked over at her and gave her a little pat on the shoulder. You're free to go, Eris. Be safe. Eris nodded and stood up awkwardly, stuffing the scroll into her leg harness while looking back and forth between Yule and Alavara. The elf looked a little stricken and a bit remorseful herself, as if she had dug too deep in a well she shouldn't have been digging in the first place. Eris wasn't sure what to do or how to leave, having never been sent off by Yule in such a fashion. She hopped on the balls of her clawed feet a few times, trying to make up her mind. Before she turned to leave, she hugged Yule from behind as best as she could, thumping her wings on him a few times. Yule just chuckled sadly, patting his hands on her own wing claws. I'm okay, Eris. Eris disengaged her hug and cleared her throat before she spun on her avian heel, trotting out of the sparkling unicorn. She stumbled around the door for an awkward moment, but finally closed it behind her. After Eris had departed from Yule's company, Alavara also left to gather herself and mull over what she had learned. She made the excuse of needing to talk to the cooks about some matters with the meat's freshness, and retreated out of the dining area to leave Yule alone. She expected perhaps an old fling or a partner departed on somewhat more amicable terms. But this just added a whole new level of intricacy to the mysterious plot of Yule. When a few more hours had passed, the rest of the Veil Riders were finally able to drag themselves down from their beds, and Chikily was rousted from his chair nest to take a parcel of letters to some of the nobles staying in the city of Immelnorris. As his Veil Riders breakfasted around him, bickering still about the topics of last night, Alavara would poke her head out from around the corners of the staff area to peek at Yule. He still sat there, writing out more letters and correspondence while chatting to his troopers, asking them how they slept or if they needed anything. When she felt comfortable enough to go behind the bar, she busied herself with cleaning glasses and tankards left over from the night before. Something was bugging Alavara, though. How the hell can a man still be mourning after 3 years? She understood the reasons behind it all, but to never even give yourself the liberty of at least enjoying the comforting touch of another person. To share a bed and stay warm against each other, flesh to flesh. The thought of suffering for so many years, alone, filled her with enough mixed emotions that it threw off her in-hustle that she usually did with easy stride. What she gleaned from this morning, she kept to herself. Even the recipe of the tea stayed secret to her, and she didn't tell the other bar workers what she had learned. The more she thought about it, she remembered she was not folly either, as she knew she never cared for marriage. 4 failures at the shtick left her fed up with the whole affair, and simply took pleasure in the partner she accompanied to her chambers every once in a while when the fancy took her. But 3 years? 3 years wrapped up in a blanket of grief was too much, even for the most stubborn of people. Unhealthy, even. It was no wonder that the man never got any sleep and was constantly sucking down anything with a drop of caffeine in it. Alavara steeled herself, slapping a wet rag onto the bar top as she once again studied Yule, who was getting up to leave. She pried harder, gripping and ripping at any thought that came her way, tucking them into her mind as if she were a pickpocket in the market square.
I'll be working on you,
she murmured, and pulled out another glass from under the storage area.
Even if I end up just another distant memory in that head, I'll make sure you can at least forget your grief for a day.
Outside, Yule stretched in the sun, his spine crackling like someone wringing a bundle of spaghetti noodles. It was really nice that Alavara had him taste test that tea she brought earlier, despite the questions she asked. Bringing back old memories was not really as nice, nor was unloading that heavy shit onto her. He thwacked his hat on his thigh to get some dust off of it, and quietly wished he'd just keep his mouth shut sometimes. As he whacked his hat, the amulet jingled inside of the rim, and he checked it while the thought was on his mind. As he held it up to the sun, he saw the magical fluid inside was running low, and he again sighed in frustration. Having to go and bug that poor woman for blood really weighed on Yule. He didn't like it, no matter how readily she was to do so. It was an evil that, while necessary, he could live without. Yule figured he would give Yethis time to relax and take on the task of actually learning the local language, as relying on the amulet wouldn't help with that. He knew a little bit of the Tunka language and was doing his damnedest to learn more just to ease the burden off of Yethis. Yule checked in with his NCOs idling outside the inn, who were working on retrofitting some kind of weird dwarven polearm to the front of a Humvee, and went for a little walk to get some fresh air. Just wander around, see the market, and think. He liked to walk and think. It was something he did all the time on Earth when he was stumped about something, or had a worry on his mind. Yule was getting reports from Zerg Company that more Valley Elves were fleeing from the smaller villages east from the Vale, flooding north and northeast. Thankfully, those kingdoms were on good, if not friendly, terms with the Valley Elves and were taking the refugees in with stride. Yule waved to Ermstrand as he passed his shop and talked to a group of school kids walking down the road in a gaggle around their teacher, asking them how their morning was as he passed. They all yelled out their answers to him while giggling. Yule's friendly smile faded from his face like a ghost as he returned to his thoughts and the reports from Coco. Coco's Vale Riders were having to employ hit-and-run guerrilla tactics to buy time for the Valley Elves, and had accomplished the goal of seizing multiple vehicles from the Phaeline forces as well, including an M1117, fully armed with its Mk.XIX automatic grenade launcher and the M2 beside it. They used it mostly for hauling around the mortars, as fuel was short on hand. Fuel in general was a steadily creeping issue, and not a single place around him as far as he could tell even knew how to make fuel, let alone find oil. Most of their fuel supply came from captured enemy sources, and that was far from reliable. Zerg Company had minor losses here and there, taking up the majority of the combat actions from the Vale Riders as a whole. They were slowly folding Valley Elves into their ranks and arming them with the spare weapons they had on hand. He rounded the street corner and came out onto the market square, which was bustling with traders and stalls hawking their vegetables or other wares. Yule breathed in the deep sense of sweat, charcoal smoke, and leather that hung around the place. It was as close as he could get to a military surplus store, and it anchored him as close to reality as he could manage. As he browsed a rack of weird rings and jars, he thought about the Vale. If the forces coming from the Vale were able to transport and put together an armored vehicle of all things, he was going to have to push his timetable forward by months in order to combat the leaps and bounds of materials the OP4 were getting from Earth. He gave a sigh and knew he needed more intel on the site for both he and Coco, and that would mean either hiring more Harpies on private order or talking to Severus, the thought of which brought goosebumps to his flesh. Yule decided to tackle the first thing, and that was hiring more scouts. He patted the money pouch he kept in his battle vest pocket, which jangled heavily with coin. Selling technological advances was keeping his Vale Riders well paid, but he kept the lion's share just for occurrences like these. Hanging proudly from a low, long building was a sign reading "Pump a Rum Package Service," out of which the chittering of Harpish echoed. It was a clippy, shrill language that he could not make head or tail of, but that appeared to be a common stance even amongst the other locals. Yule put his hat on tight to his head and opened the door to the rather unenthusiastic mug of Roland, the elf who ran the place and did most of the bookkeeping. Beside him was a wide-eyed owl harpy named Noria, who helped him manage the packing ledgers, as they had a few extra digits on their wing claws that allowed them to hold a pen with some accuracy. They both greeted him in their own fashions, Noria being chipper, while Roland sounded as if he could just give up on life at any moment. Yule put in an order for 6 of the sneakiest harpies they had in the place, and Noria stepped away to go fetch them. As she did, she twisted her neck 180 degrees to the rear and peered at him with her bright yellow eyes.
Are you fine with any harpy, Mr. Yule?
Yep, thank you, Yule said grimly, as his stomach turned when she smiled and twisted her head back around. He understood why she could do it, but damn it to hell if it wasn't the freakiest thing in the world to see. Roland busied himself with doing paperwork, leaving Yule to rock back and forth on his boot heels, waiting for the owl harpy to return. Noria eventually arrived with a little gang of harpies behind her. Most of these were male, with only one of the 5 being female. These were a curious bunch, and reminded him a lot of nighthawks from back home. Their hair and feathers were stippled and camouflaged to the point they could probably fall into a pile of leaves and never be found, which was helped by their sun-kissed skin and dark, almost black eyes. Even more curious were their facial markings, which looked a lot like freckles but ranged in size and shape, probably camouflage as well if Yule had to make a guess. They introduced themselves as the Brush-Feathered, and were keen to be paid for their work first and foremost. They didn't even ask what the work was, just how much coin would be jingling in their pockets. This caught Yule off guard, but he rallied quickly and told them to follow him. The Brush-Feathered followed him outside, down the street, and finally into the sparkling unicorn, in which Yule then began to explain his plan. For a hefty sum of silver shanks, they were to collect intelligence as close to the camp as possible, even getting as close to hear people talking, or even read things left out in the open. The Brush-Feathered confidently told him this wouldn't be a problem.
Brush-Feather's been paid to sneak before. This will be no different.
One spoke up, an older male who grinned at Yule with pearly white teeth. Yule could understand their aptitude for subterfuge, as these harpies lacked any real claws, sharp wing digits, or even long fangs for combat. Yule confirmed the deal with them, gave them some spare BDU and Flecktarn shorts, as well as a few ghillie suits that they could use if they believed they could come in handy. The Brush-Feathered snatched them up almost immediately, and were talking excitedly in their mother tongue of Harpish about the strange suits for some time. After leaving to retrieve their own specially made satchels and pack sacks, Yule went up to talk to Brita. She was reading inside her room, having been given her rucksack after she identified it from the loot, and looked up to Yule as he cracked open the door. "Going to stick another splinter in me?" Yule asked, raising his eyebrows as the guard outside her door also leaned to the side to peek in at her.
No. Would be a shame to ruin your nice uniform again.
Brita breathed out sarcastically, flipping a page in her book.
Not unless you are thinking of dragging me back down to that cellar.
Ha ha. Yule mused in a low tone and crossed his arms. "I'm sending out some tourists to the Vale base you lot have set up. I want you to write me a few
Already have.
Brita interrupted, her face set as she pulled out 10 sheets of parchment with names written on them, and the other sides littered with paragraphs of German in tight, orderly script. Yule couldn't help but smile as he reached over and took the papers in a cool manner. Peak German efficiency. Brita snorted and opened her book back up. Yule closed the door behind him, pressed his patrol cap to his scalp, but the letters didn't change as they usually did. Yule growled out a heckin' heck to the ceiling of the inn before rumbling down the stairs to look for Yethis. She was thankfully bugging Gremlin, sitting next to her and brushing her hair as she played Dwarf Fortress on her laptop. "Zine ved, lek denderkot," Yule said in Tunka to Yethis as he tapped her on her shoulder, and she spun around on her rump to face him. In the blink of an eye, she had her special little dagger out and sliced open her finger while rummaging in her side pouch for the other ingredient, something that they called True Earth ink. Yule watched her slice open her flesh with gathered eyebrows, glaring down at the little wound as he pulled out his amulet. He hated this part. He really did. She pulled the stopper of the little bottle out with her teeth, the sharp pop of it causing her to smile around the cork in her mouth. The dark, inky liquid flowed into the amulet Yule held in his fingers, which she then recorked the bottle and placed her finger over the lip of the well, letting her blood drain slowly into the amulet. She smiled up at him and wrinkled her nose, wiggling back and forth on her seat. Unbeknownst to Yule, Yethis took this task as a great honor, that her blood was the one to fuel the amulet that he would use, as well as being his personal healer. She still felt a bit silly for fainting when he needed her earlier, but still counted the healing as her own doing since it was her blood that was used, after all. Yethis was known as a clean blood, an elf whose blood was rich and flowing with the necessities that were needed for strong, formidable magic. She took a lot of pride in this, and to be serving a commander of the Veil Riders was an honor all in itself. When the amulet well was full, she licked her finger clean by poking it into her mouth and tapped the amulet to get it back to working again. Yule tucked it up into his hat, then placed it on his head before speaking to her. "I don't like this, you know." Yethis smiled up at him from around her finger before pulling it from her mouth and wiping the saliva on her pant leg.
I know that. You've told me enough. But it has to be done.
Not the only thing.
They both just barely heard, and they turned to see Alavara walking away with a tray loaded with empty mugs. Yethis glared at her, standing up and brushing past Yule to stalk after the elf. Yule went to speak up, but the front door of the sparkling unicorn thudded open, and the brush feathered were back with their equipment, calling after Yule while other Veil Riders stood behind them and tucked random goodies into their sacks. Yule quickly read through the letters as he made his way towards the chittering harpies, who were pumped up for the mission given to them and buzzing with anticipation. He didn't see anything negative in the letters as he read, and began folding them up into squares. Besides the random things tucked into their sacks, the harpies were given some rations, water, and a few knives just in case they needed to saw or cut away at anything. Yule then gave them the letters and gave them examples of the unit flags they should look out for, being the German, Polish, and Czech flags respectively. After everything was double-checked, the brush-feathered set off on foot out into the grasslands to move on the ground during the day and then fly during night to avoid detection. Yule turned back into the inn while rubbing his temples and called out for Domino and the other NCOs. When they were gathered, he sent them off to do supply checks on their own troopers, everything from ammunition to the amount of money they still had on them. There was a small issue of Veil Riders blowing all their money on stupid stuff and not giving the inn a small portion of it, whether that was in tips or paying for their food. While the city was paying for a lot of the supplies and space the Veil Riders took up, that didn't mean he wanted his troopers to look like bums. This was, of course, to curry good favor towards the Veil Riders, and Yule felt like he had dozens of eyes watching him from afar, the powers at time gauging on whether or not he was a solid horse to bet on. Hours were buzzing by as Yule went to and fro, doing housekeeping on his unit, when for the second time that day the door was kicked open. Yule turned to see who it was, just having set off to see how many mechanics he had total for truck checkups, and he felt a headache coming on as he saw who was in the doorway. "Ah, for fuck's sakes." A dwarf called out, pulling a traveling hood from his head. "Oi, veiling!" Yule's previous gentle temple rubbing turned into vigorous massaging as Focket Ailwrench shouldered past the door, 3 of his engineers following behind him. Chicks rolled her eyes, shutting the door for them with the side of her boot while clicking her teeth in annoyance. Yule held out a hand towards the lead dwarf, trying to look as friendly as he could manage. "Fuck it, how are you? I thought you were still back in your hold. I just sent a letter to Takes too long, so I came here." Focket interrupted and pointed to a table in the corner while walking over to it. Chix's blonde eyebrows shot up, and she smirked mockingly at Yule while jutting out her lips. "Shut up. You're lucky you don't have to deal with this shit." Yule hissed in English and walked over to the dwarves while Chix chuckled and brought her ale tankard to her lips. Yule, for one, was getting tired of being interrupted and waved over at the bar area for some drinks. Alavara wasn't there anymore, and neither was Yethis, but a bar woman saw him and began pouring for the dwarves. He sat down at the table and looked into the face of Focket. Focket was an engineer prince, son of Snorri Ailwrench, who was Thane of the engineering hold called Kerbadir. Snorri, as it turns out, was the first dwarf he met in the city, the same one that almost crushed his hand, and had sent his son Focket to try and garner some designs from the Veil Riders. These dwarves of Kerbadir were all in on the Icelandic look, and for all Yule knew, probably invented it themselves. Hair short-cropped on the sides while long on top, braided hair and beards adorned with strategically placed gold beads and spiraling drakes that curled through the rough strands. And all of them had long walking axes that really reminded Yule of a certain dwarf that was famous for sprinting long distances. He could see from the crossed pistols on the chest of the female engineer that they were already headlining a dwarven semi-automatic pistol of sorts, which looked oddly like a Sig P226, except chunkier and covered in runes. Yule nodded towards them, letting the amulet do its work. How many of those are there? The dwarven female chuckled and gave her bountiful chest a jiggle.
Just 2, love.
Yule casted his eyes heavenward as the other dwarves at the table hooted and slapped the tabletop, roaring with laughter at his expense. I fucking swear. Yule thought to himself as the barmaid made her way over and began setting down tankards that were peaked with foam. Now that she had made them jiggle, Yule had to fight to keep his eyes up and off of her, and the she-dwarf was certainly taking a notice, hooding her eyes and folding her arms under her breasts so they looked even more prominent. You know what I mean, ma'am. Snorri only had a quick hand on my M9 for a few minutes, and you have already managed to make something that looks like a proper semi-automatic pistol. The female dwarf smirked at Yule, and he felt her boot heel rest on top of his own boot's toe.
Dwarfs don't need long to make an idea a reality. We just need to get our hands on it for a while and it all comes naturally.
Yule quietly wished that Fockett had chosen a bigger table and had to keep moving his foot to keep the dwarf from trying to pin it down with her own.
For Fromface's sake, Gale, leave him be.
Spoke up the other engineer as he calmed his humors, then motioned to Fockett while taking a drink from his tankard.
Right, began Fockett. It's not hard to make these things by hand. It takes a little while, sure, but they were quite easy to figure out. Anyway, I'm sure you heard from down south those old Utharian bastards are getting a big head of themselves and snatching up folk, as well as using your people's resources to seek their own gains. Ain't good. Not at all. We need to increase war production and begin pumping out weapons that can contend with yours. My sister went over to see your friend Coco and is already taking plans for those things they call danger tubes back to the hold. I'm not gonna yank you around on this. We want one of your rifles to take back, and one you would recommend. We've been working hard on the quick to get up to date on those manufacturing techniques for the cartridges. Which, by the way,
Fockett said with a flourish as he parted the drapes of the nearby window and gestured outside.
We have a nice little present for you.
Yule leaned to the side and peeped out to see there were crates sitting on the road by the Humvees, in which Vale riders were crowding around and plucking handfuls of brand new gleaming ammunition and sprinkling them on each other. The dwarves around them laughed and helped sprinkle the new ammunition on a female Vale rider who was making a brass angel. Yule had to admit these dwarves were slicker than goose shit when it came to getting jobs down quick.
And now,
Yule said, leaning back down into his seat as Gilla winked and kissed her lips at him. He grimaced at her in return.
Now we want a present too. And no, Gilla, we stick to the plan. Quit being weird.
Fockett growled and slapped Gilla on the shoulder with the back of his hand. She laughed rakishly as she was pointing at Yule and was about to lean over and say something to Fockett. Yule ignored her and moved his jaw around as he thought, mulling over the fact that he really did owe Fockett for bringing this much ammunition and getting the jobs done within days, when he had set aside entire months and time frames. He had already researched a little bit about the dwarves, and they appeared to focus a lot of their magical talents into their manufacturing and production, same as the horn folk called the Brim-Touched. He looked back to the dwarves, running the edge of his thumb along his cheek. Pick a caliber. This single statement made all four dwarves turn on their serious faces, and they leaned in while gripping their tankards.
That 5.56 round can fly forever, it seems like. Pass from mountain to mountain without much issue,
stated the other male engineer.
Aye, but that 7.62 has a lot of power behind it,
purred Gilla, and once again Yule felt her boot start touching his. Both Yule and Fockett thought the same phrase at her tone of voice, and both of them glared at her as "please stop" filtered through their faces. Fockett flicked his eyes back to Yule.
We were curious. After finding the materials, working on the alchemy behind the propellant, and figuring out the right flash powder for the caps, we made some rough barrels and shot a few dummies just to see what they could do. We were quite embarrassed that this kind of design hadn't come to us sooner, as it is quite simple in principle once the kinks were ironed out. You worked out the kinks in only a few days, while it took us, well, more time. Anyway, I favor the 5.56. It holds up better at longer ranges and has less recoil. That being said, I also prefer the 7.62 by 5.1 when it comes to stopping power. Then there's the weapon issue, I suppose. Yule mused, taking a quick drink from his tankard. He wasn't sure this was the right idea, but he stood up. I'll be right back. He left and returned with his K2 and a spare FAL after a few minutes, setting them on the table. Of all the rifles I've used, this one has never failed me and has performed better than any of my other rifles. Then this is a very iconic rifle that uses the 7.62 round and is a favorite of my other co-commander, Coco. Here are a few magazines from the other rifles we use. He set the metal magazines next to the K2 and FAL, having borrowed some from the Veil Riders who were using FALs and M14s, and his own Stanak magazine. If I were to hedge my bets, these rifle designs would serve you well in either caliber. I don't doubt you guys can figure out the simple human science behind it. You could also use more magazines if you can find a way to get them out to us. Fawcett clapped his hands together cheerfully. Excellent! Are you sure you don't mind? This is your personal rifle after all. Yule looked down at the K2 laying on the table and nodded. It's fine. Just treat her nice and bring her back when you're done. Fawcett and the other male engineers grinned toothily and began to get up, draining their tankards as they did and grabbing the K2, as well as the FAL. Gale stood up after gathering the magazines together, and when Yule had gotten up from his seat, she bumped him with her hip.
Need anything else taken care of while I'm here?
Her eyes crinkled with humor as she grinned up at Yule, who looked down at her while trying to keep his eyes away from her deep cleavage. Not to mention her hip bump had nearly thrown Yule off balance, and he was shocked by the recoil on that thing. You really are horrible, Yule muttered, crossing his arms as he watched Fawcett pull back the charging handle on the FAL. Gale cackled and slapped Yule on the seat of his pants as she walked behind him, striding towards the door where her fellow dwarves were exiting out into the late-day sun. Gale stood at the door and gave him another sultry wink.
I know,
she breathed, and closed the door behind her when she left. Chix had an eyebrow raised, looking from the door over to Yule from where she had leaned against the wall.
Man, men probably go into her as salami and come out as a Slim Jim from muscles that strong.
Chix, please don't. I would like to enjoy my dinner here in a bit, Yule growled, and wiped a bit of sweat from his brow. Where the hell was the bit in the stories about dwarven women being man-eaters? Chix just chuckled to herself, more at her joke than anything, then nodded and spoke in Tunka as Yethis came striding across the inn.
Dinda, Yethis.
Yule turned, and behind him Yethis stood, beaming her bright smile and holding a mug in both of her hands. Out of the mug came the spiraling scent of cinnamon and the sweet smell of comfort. Yethis held out the mug to him.
Alavara said you might need this after that mean dwarf woman. What's in it anyways? It smells like bug repellent.
And that is the end of this chapter of the Veil Riders Book 1 Mark II. If you like this story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbro's Field Desk. Join us on Discord, join us on Twitter, join us wherever the hell we are, really. And join the coffee as a member, because members get free little sneaky peeks, little teasers through the week. They get a special channel on the Discord where they get to see the whips of all the art. And I read out your name at the end of the fucking videos and all that fun, usual YouTuber stuff. First up on the first shirts, these guys give $50 per month to the channel, and these guys are carrying the channel upon their shoulders, bearing me aloft to greatness. I'll be Some Dude, Allspark113, E-Machino, Cody Jiro, Death Dancer, and Insane Medic. Then there's the E4 Mafia. These guys get $25 per month and make up the bulk of the members. The Great Baguette, Sonic Arrow, Splug the Goblin, Darkside, Kiwi Bastard, Lacune 8, Lacune, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, and Crusader 0625. And then there's Snuffy Squad. These guys get $5 per month and are the unwashed masses of the coffee members. Davey McEwen, Split Iris Bear, Super Stink 64, Eldorok, Chromin, Dalek, Jules, Blonde Lord, Thrace Vega, Devin Sean, Holtz, Enter In, Gil, Yeti Potato, Skelters, Cat Zero, Classic Cthulhu, Ranger Inspired, Diesel Dog, Coffee Commander, Anto, Inquisitor Matt, Duncan D, and I'm the Loresmith. And until we see you next time on this side of the veil. That was Franner, our proofreader and more or less Discord mom. That was Eliza. That was Rue. That was Hailey. That was Simba. That was Meowsy, that was Vynn, that was Technoward, and this is Garbro's Field Desk. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.